Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for showing up so early. We have the honor today of Dr. George Ford, who I've been reading for years and trying to understand for longer than that. He has a somewhat thankless task. He tries to figure out if you're trying to create a new policy or fix a problem, is your methodology going to actually work? So I thought today what we'd take a look at is some examples of big, contentious policy matters, and whether, in fact, the approaches we've taken have worked or have helped at all. So, what would you say is the most misunderstood thing about communications policy?
I think from the regulatory perspective, and most of you guys I think are in interconnection and will understand this pretty well already, is in the regulatory sphere and the policy sphere, there's this trade-off between competition and regulation. And in the old days, we've kind of regulated the whole thing, and competition's developed, and now we're trading off one for the other. But the regulator has a very poor understanding of competition and what competition is, where it comes from. And in particular, the number of firms that occupy space, which is often the measure of competition, is a head count. There are 3 guys doing that or 2 guys doing that, and so there's a duopoly or whatever it is. But they don't understand where that comes from. And the economics is pretty sound. The FCC has cited the economic arguments on occasion. And it's basically how big is the market, how much does it cost to be in the market, and how fierce is price competition, right? And if you can wrap things up, and I always do this in my own work, in fact, that's the model I go back to all the time. You can check out the Phoenix Center's Policy Paper 21 if you want to see it laid out in a sort of layman's terms, is if a policy wants to impact competition, okay, promote competition, as they say, and regulators never promote competition. They get out of the way of competition. We don't need regulators to promote anything. We need them out of the way for the most part. Profit seeking promotes competition. You have market size. Is your policy going to make the market bigger or smaller? Entry cost. Is your policy going to make it more expensive or less expensive to be in this business? And price competition. Is this policy going to increase or decrease the intensity of price competition? Oddly enough, if you increase the intensity of price competition, you end up with fewer competitors because there's not enough margin to cover the big fixed cost of being in the telephone business. So the FCC is always fighting this thing, and Congress as well, where you have, I want firms to really fiercely compete, and I'm really mad that there are only 2 people in this business, where being 2 people in the business may just be the consequence of very fierce price competition, right? So it's just really a poor understanding, I think, of how the industry develops and how competition develops. And you see this pretty much in any discussion, public discussion coming out on public policy. It's just a misunderstanding of that.
Yeah, so it's basically in the fixed line business, is the numbers boiled down to, is 1 or 2 the better number, and in the mobile segment, is it 3 or is it 4?
Right. I mean, I think that's the way you should think about it. And I think, the first thing you say when people start talking about competition is, so what? People say, oh, there's only 2 competitors in there. You ought to say thank you. I was young at the FCC. I'm not so young anymore. When I first out of grad school, went to the FCC. And if we thought we would have duopoly in video and voice, we would have thought that the FCC would have shut down. We would have had a big party, and it would have shut down. We'd have gone home, because that was the goal. Right? If you look at the Cable Act, for example, the goal was duopoly. And in fact, in the Cable Act, the Congress said, deregulate cable if there's a half a competitor. Right? That's the world we were living in. Now we've got many, many choices, but we still act like there's not. And we always like to say, what's the number of competitors the FCC wants? And the answer is 1 more, right? Wherever you are. So how many guitars does a guitar player need? 1 more. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Related to this, there's sometimes a confusion between values or opinions, even if they're well-founded,
Yeah.
and policies.
Right.
What does that mean?
Yeah, well, this constantly comes up in my own work when you look at what people are talking about. There's ideas and then there are policies, okay? An open internet is an idea. It is not a policy, okay? An idea is I want to have clean bathrooms at my restaurant. That's an idea. A policy is so-and-so will go to the bathroom every 2 hours, he will clean it with Clorox and a mop, and he'll put, new towels in and refill the soap if it's less than 50% full, so on and so forth, right? That's a policy. So we're constantly debating about net neutrality. Well, what the hell is that? Open internet, what is that? And the debate occurs at this level, when really what we need to know, and I see companies do this too, where they say, I want this idea, and you say, well, what rule would you like the FCC to write? And they have no clue what rule they want the FCC to write, when that is the fundamental question. Net neutrality in the U.S. turned out to be, in one of its incarnations, the application of portions of Title II to the carriers, and they basically said, I think, that you can't charge a positive price to any particular edge provider for terminating traffic on the local network, which was price regulation without due process. There was no cost study that said zero price was optimal. I'm not regulating the retail side of the market that says you get enough profit on the retail side of the market to make up for the zero price on the wholesale side of the market. Okay? And then by the way, I'm going to take away tariffing, which takes away your due process rights to challenge the FCC's confiscatory rate. That's what net neutrality was in 2015. Okay? It wasn't an open internet. Okay? It was this weird thing about Title II, which largely violated everything about Title II. But the debate there turned into a dichotomy of either we apply Title I or we apply Title II. And it didn't matter if we threw out everything in Title II as long as we said we applied Title II, because people were trying to fundraise on policy promotion. And if the light switch is on and off, it's very easy to determine. If you're in the policy world, you know that no decision ever comes out like that very often, right? You win half of your arguments, okay? And if everybody's pissed off, then that's a good policy. And in here you had a case where we flipped the switch and it worked out, and people raised a lot of money on that, but the FCC just completely mutilated the statute and process. Thank God it was overturned.
This stuff seems sort of abstract, but every issue you've discussed this morning, I was debating out in the hall yesterday.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just one of those things that never goes away. One of the things that I still don't understand about this whole net neutrality argument is everybody seems to agree you shouldn't have the right to block lawful content, and basically nobody does that. Maybe Comcast tried it once, and some small company, Madison River, tried it once. They've stopped. Nobody really does it. But the assumption seems to be that access providers are so evil that they'll literally build a network that's crappy so that they can force you to buy a better product for a higher price. I just don't see that in the real world. No executive I know thinks that way.
Well, I think you would, who flew business class over here? I mean, some people, they think that way about it. I think that the net neutrality argument originated in, I think, in two comparable situations, or uncomparable really, but similar situations, similar enough. One was payola. Back in the U.S., we have radio stations that play music, and back years ago, decades ago, the radio record industry would pay radio stations to play their music. So they would get prioritized through a compensation scheme. Okay, that's what people are thinking about when they think net neutrality. The bank is going to pay Verizon or AT&T to make them the sole provider of banking services on the internet. Okay, that comes from that idea. And also where you locate end capping and preferences in grocery stores. Is your cereal on the top row or the bottom row, right? And people pay for these preferred positions. It's the same sort of thing. All those cases, though, are dealing with scarcity, right? A very hard-line scarcity problem. You can only play one song at a time, and you can only have one box of cereal on the third row from the bottom in the middle. in the internet, it doesn't operate like that at all. There doesn't have the scarcity component to it. It can do almost everything at the same time. So it would have to be artificial scarcity, which is the way people talk about it. But the minute somebody says, oh, it has to be artificial scarcity, you know that the thing is going to fall apart from the economic perspective, because that's really not going to be terribly useful. Although in baseball cards, you see the creation of artificial scarcity to drive up value. Okay, but I don't think, and I've never seen a paper that could show that a network would actually disable itself in order to create a low quality product so that it could, but it could also sell a high quality product. I don't think that would ever be profitable, and I've never seen a paper demonstrate that it would be.
But yeah, and just anecdotally, if the cable operators were really going to not invest, why would they be talking about a 10G product going beyond gigabit now? Why would they even do that if they were trying to sell a faster product to the regular consumers?
Right, but I think it's the funny thing about the deployment of speed is that there's a pattern to this. And most of these cable networks have been capable of much higher than what they're selling, but they're in the business of selling, right, and marketing. And they make a network. When I got my cable modem a few years ago, got off DSL on the cable modem, the guy came in and hooked it up, and we were talking, so he knew I was in the business. And he hooked my modem up, and we ran it, and I was getting 400 megabits a second. Of course, then he set it at the service I bought, and I was getting 60 megabits per second. But it was capable of many times that. But you know, you have to think about how this thing plays out. And what we've seen, particularly when you get the government involved in building networks, and they think, oh, everybody wants a 10 gig circuit, and we just had that in Salisbury. We're gonna be the 1 gig city, and then we're gonna be the 10 gig city. Not realize that there's nothing you can do with any of that. And of course, the network Salisbury eventually went bankrupt, or out of business, because it's just crazy. I mean, the guys have a pretty good idea of what kind of bandwidth is needed, and they're continually upgrading. I suspect that they might make it more vocal now, so that the government network people don't sort of get ahead of them on speed, just in the marketing department.
Yeah, this sort of reminds me of the what I call it the "why don't you drive a Tesla" problem, which is we talk about broadband deployment and consumption as though they're the same things. And you know, so the way I boil this down is I don't drive a Tesla, and I can tell you why.
Yeah.
How does that play out in the policy discussion?
It doesn't. You know, everybody should have a gig. You know, that's the way a lot of people think about it, and that's not true. I mean, even in places where they have it, nobody buys it. I mean, there's just really, I mean, it's just kind of a cool thing to have, unless that's the only thing that's offered. But I mean, I remember some statistics back when Japan or Korea, I think, was deploying really high-speed broadband years ago, and nobody bought it. You know, I mean, the network was capable of many, many times what people were buying, but I think, you know, 70% or 75% of the people were buying a 6 megabit per second circuit, which is basically what the cable industry was selling at the time. And a lot of times you get, like, I mean, the fact that right now you go get your mobile phone. I'm pretending like all you Americans. Some people from other countries might not face this or may have always faced it. It used to be the case you could go to a wireless provider, become their customer, sign a 2-year contract, and get an $800 phone for $200. And that was great. You can't do that anymore. Okay, now you go in there and you pay $800 for a phone, and the price hasn't gone down for the service. And the reason was basically came out of net neutrality. It was this idea that asking people to commit to being a customer for 2 years to get a $600 discount on a phone was somehow un-American or evil or something. You know, I mean, it was nuts. And the government put pressure on them, put pressure on forcing the customers. Where you had, if you wanted to keep it, you signed a contract for 2 years. That's not worth much. But if you left, you end up having to pay some fee to leave, $300-400 or something like that. So we started off saying, well, we're going to make that trickle down where it's $400 the first year, $300 the second year, or whatever. And the carriers just said, pooh, I'm not interested. Everybody thought this whole 2-year contract thing was anti-competitive. I mean, the carriers loved it when it went away. That was a huge, you look at a wireless provider's 10K or 10Q the quarter after the new iPhone comes out, and they are losing money hands over fist as they're giving away all these phones. Now they don't have to do that anymore. They're basically in the credit card business now, You still have a 2-year contract, or you can leave as soon as you want to, but by the way, you're still paying me $30 a month for the phone until it's paid off. So the policy solves nothing and ended up costing consumers a lot of money and increased the profits of the carriers when the whole argument was supposed to be the opposite of that, right? And that's the opposite was supposed to happen. But then again, the people just don't understand how business works and didn't look at the economics, despite the fact I showed it to them.
People have their opinions and they don't care about the facts.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Now, zero rating is one of those things. It hasn't been hot in the last 6 months, but you know, if you care about every human being on the planet having good internet, then why not use a tool like a discount or free service to sort of get you in the habit of buying?
We have the whole broadcast television industry, which was basically founded on an advertising model of delivery. Lots of people have tried advertising models for internet delivery over the years, and I imagine some people here from other countries probably have that now. The interesting thing about zero rating is one of the big problems with one of the reason people say that mobile is not a substitute for wireline, even though it's obviously not true. The argument is that, I consume a bunch of high bandwidth video or whatever, right, and I eat up my data plan too quick. And some carrier comes along, AT&T at the time I think was doing it, T-Mobile was doing it, says, I'll tell you what, I'll let you have a slightly lower quality video, which on your little 5-inch screen you can't tell the difference, and I won't count that against your data cap. I would have paid a lot of money for that service. I got kids who watch YouTube and those sorts of things. I would have paid money for that, but then you have the policy wonks in Washington come in and say, oh no, they can't have that. You can't offer this service that people would actually pay for and has value because you're going to offer one company an advantage over another, and even though that's really not what happened, okay? But a lot of this stuff, as you see, all policy is like this, okay? There's this debate that's going on, and everybody says, oh, this is good for consumers and the big old bad companies over there. And you throw out the consumer has no representative in Washington, D.C. Okay, this is a carrier versus another company. In the old days, it was a carrier versus another carrier, and now it's these companies versus those companies. The whole net neutrality debate was hijacked by edge providers very early on, and every debate is. You have to ask yourself the question, what company benefits from this policy, and what company is harmed by this policy? And once you start thinking about it that way, you pretty much figure out what's going on. In Washington. I had one of the first things I did when I was young at the FCC, we had a meeting on broadcast law, and the FCC has to review regulations every couple of years and throw stuff out that it doesn't use anymore. And we were looking at broadcast law, and everybody was sitting there going, okay, here's this broadcast law, what does this do, what are the benefits of it, and they're carrying on and going on, and I let them ride on it for about half an hour. And I'd say, let's just reorient this discussion. And let's stop asking how this law benefits consumers and start asking how this law benefits the regulated firm. And then every rule made perfect sense, right? There was no confusion about what this law was intended to do, okay? And that's the way now we've got this whole new dynamic in Washington. It used to be at one time the long-distance guys fought the local guys, right? And we're all fighting over, and every argument's about price in the end too. We were all fighting about price, access prices, we called them. What price would the long-distance guy have to pay to terminate his call, right? So you had pretty clear who you were dealing with. The cable industry fought the broadcast industry, the long-distance industry fought the local industry. And now we've had the internet, which has turned the whole thing upside down, and now we have to start looking around and find the new guys, which is why there's been no telecom law, because we don't know who all the parties are and what the results are going to be and who we're going to extract from and what favors do we got to give to get this thing through. And now I think we're really at a situation where it's the edge guys, the Facebooks and the Googles and all those guys fighting the network guys. And that's the whole net neutrality debate is right there. Although Tim Brennan, who's a great economist, was in Europe watching a discussion and became convinced that the whole net neutrality debate in the U.S. was an attempt to establish precedent here that could be exported to Europe mainly to keep Europeans from charging American companies to terminate traffic. Because Google and Facebook and all these companies are American companies, right? So the Europeans don't care if we charge to terminate them and take some of their profits through some kind of termination fee, okay? And so he was convinced that that really what the American policy was, and we do this all the time. We come up with some stupid policy and we think we got to sell this to every nation on the planet. And then, you know, by the time it gets sold and people start buying, we've moved on to something else and canceled the old one. I mean, I gave a talk on unbundling 5 years after unbundling was destroyed by the FCC. So, you know, it's really a company v. company. And don't really think that this has something to do with consumers. It almost never does. Okay?
George, that's fantastic. We are out of time, but I suspect you and I will be out there in the hall as soon as we're done. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gary. Appreciate it.